Today we're talking about one of the most influential books of all time, most certainly one of the most influential books in Western thought. They say all roads lead to Rome. Well, all Western thought leads to Greece, specifically ancient Greece, and Plato, and by extension, Socrates. We're talking about Plato's Republic, and today we're going to discuss how best to read Plato's Republic, and indeed why you should read Plato's Republic. Consider this to be a bit of an introductory video, an introduction to the work, and my aim here today is to have a discussion that will energize, inspire, and embolden two kinds of reader. I hope that this discussion is an aid to those who have never picked up the Republic before or have never even picked up a work of philosophy. We're dipping our toes in and we're going to make it easier to breach this incredibly canonical foundational text. And of course, I hope this discussion will offer something of value to those of you who have read the Republic before. We're going to be bringing in an interesting paradigm, and we're going to utilize some of the tools that we have learnt from reading, deep reading, great imaginative literature, because I believe that if we bring those tools in to an incredibly powerful work like Plato's Republic, we can get so much out of the work. This video assumes no prior knowledge on your part, but if you would like to give Plato's Republic a really deep reading and follow along with the upcoming hardcore literature lecture series, Plato's Poetics, Reading the Republic as Imaginative Literature, then at the end we'll have a brief discussion on the layout of the lecture land, because I will be issuing you specific reading assignments, book reading assignments per lecture. Let's talk about Plato's Republic, and I would like to begin by emphasizing the need for bringing a lot of care, time, attention, and a slow pace to these canonical works. When you come to Plato's Republic, I want you to come armed with a few mindsets. When you approach a book like Plato's Republic, it's really key to keep in mind that you should be making up your own mind, and you are thinking everything through on paper. We are aiming to bring these discussions into living experience, into our world today, and give them as much care and attention as possible. You cannot speed read Plato. You cannot speed read his Republic. So as you approach Plato's Republic, I would really love if you considered your reading of this canonical text as deep self-work. That means find yourself a table or find yourself a comfy chair, get yourself a pen, get yourself a dedicated journal, and get yourself a copy of the work that you are prepared to scribble in the margins of. My top recommendation is the Robin Waterfield edition. This one is absolutely perfect, boasting ample margin space so that you can do your own working on paper. Plato's Republic, or Plato's Res Publica, so called thanks to Cicero's Latin translation, De Republica, Republica referring to matters of public affair or the Commonwealth, and Plato's Greek title being Politeia, so titled because the book is about the polis or the city-state, how best to govern the city-state. Plato's Republic was written around 345 BC, which means it's not one of his immature works and comes in the mid-stage of his career. The overarching theme of Plato's Republic is dikaiosine, or justice. What is justice? What makes one just? What makes one unjust? And I do find it a useful thing to do to establish what the overarching thematic preoccupation is in any text, be it philosophy or imaginative literature. There are some incredible passages in the Republic that can most certainly be read and enjoyed in isolation. There are passages on philosopher kings and how best to educate philosopher kings. We have Plato's theory of forms, we have Plato's allegory of the cave, and we have a delightful section on the banishment and censorship of poets like Homer, and it's with a little bit of irony, with my tongue a little bit in my cheek, that I call our lecture series Plato's Poetics, Reading the Republic as Imaginative Literature, because whilst Plato's Republic is an extraordinary work of imaginative literature. It's a great piece of fiction. It's a great piece of potential dramatic literature, and you could stage much of the Republic. And in many parts, it reads like a primitive form of the novel. It's quite exciting to see it in this way. I see Plato as being a little bit of a frustrated poet, a little bit of a frustrated playwright, perhaps. And maybe the banishment of great writers like Homer, and keep in mind that at time of writing, at the time of Socrates and Plato, Homer was pretty much the entire canon. Homer was the tradition. I see the banishment of Homer and Hesiod as being out of a little bit of jealousy, a little bit of artistic jealousy. When the Republic opens, we meet one of the most influential figures in all of Western history. We meet Socrates. And Socrates and his friends, his associates, his conversation partners are discussing the nature of morality and justice. And early on we have this incredible figure, this personage known as Thrasymachus. And we all know Thrasymachus. He's a bit of a angry, forceful figure who is trying to one-up Socrates, and doesn't really want to be bested by Socrates, doesn't want Socrates to talk him down or talk over him. And Thrasymachus essentially says that right is on the side of might. And when we talk about justice, what we're actually talking about is what is good for the strongest party. And the weaker party must be subservient, and their duties are constructed according to what the stronger party has led them to believe or forced upon them. There's this wonderful conversation about the nature of good and the different kinds of good, and there's this great discussion on the fact that everybody would be unjust if they could get away with it. And the only reason we are just, or we follow any sense of morals, which again are given to us by the stronger party, because we are more terrified of tyranny and its negative effects upon us, then we desire to be a tyrant ourselves. But if we could get away with it, we would all act in our best interest. And there's this brilliant conversation that shoots off from there, and brilliantly Socrates suggests that they create their own city in words. They create their own city so as to see what justice is like on the macro level, and then of course they can discern what makes a just individual. So we see it on the macro so as to better see it on the individual level, and they set about in conversation building the Republic. Now, The Republic is an incredibly important book, and indeed, we can't really say that we understand Western thought. We can't understand many of the greatest works in the last few hundred years if we haven't already garnered a good understanding of the Republic. It's important for us to continue reading the Republic, and indeed all of Plato's works, and learning from Socrates, becoming Socrates' disciples once again, because if we have any hope at instilling the love of learning into the next generation, we must first begin with Socrates. It all trickles down from Socrates. The wonderful thing about the dialogues of Plato and the Socratic method of discourse is we are learning about aided discovery. Socrates aids our discovery. He doesn't simply tell us something. He paces us, he leads us, he unpicks our underlying assumptions, he poses lots of different questions to us, and indeed we may disagree with his underlying assumptions and we may disagree with where he ends up, but we surely cannot disagree with the method. The method is incredibly instructive, incredibly beneficial and instrumental, so much so that academies like Oxford and Cambridge have modelled their tutorial system on the Socratic dialogues. Socrates' preoccupation can essentially be boiled down to the question of how best to live. And as we read through great works like The Republic, Socrates helps us see the truth ourselves. And we're aided in our discovery of the truth, in our learning to love and relish philosophy by artifice. Very much like imaginative literature. The works, the dialogues of Plato, and most particularly with the Republic, we are presented with an artifice, we are presented with a construction, a lie that helps us see the truth. Now, before we dive into some paradigms and some mindset shifts that I believe you should take into your deep reading of the Republic, let's talk about who was Plato and who was Socrates anyway. Well, Plato was born around 428 BC, towards the end of the Peloponnesian War. He was born into aristocracy, essentially, and he was related to the the rulers of what was known as the 30 tyrants. Plato attributed the downfall of Athens to democracy, and though there are elements in the Republic that are rather democratic, and though there are elements of democracy or democratic thought in the real-life Republic that inspired the work we have before us today, Plato was not a fan of democracy, and indeed he saw democracy as being responsible for the death of Socrates. The incredible thing about Plato is just how thoroughly he has been misunderstood, maligned, taken out of context over the years. Many who read Plato try their utmost to meet him. Readers of works like the Republic try to fit their own conclusions to the conclusions they are presented with. There's this aura around canonical works like Plato's Republic in which we don't want to question what's before us. We go in with the underlying assumption that this is the truth. This is a foundational piece of philosophy, and surely the reason it's so foundational and canonical is because it's true. Well, it's mainly to do with the style of philosophical discourse rather than the conclusions that are arrived at. I would quite strongly hope that if you engage with Plato, the Republic, if you engage with Socrates and you question, you bring your own inquisitive mind to the text before you, I would hope that you do not arrive at the same conclusions as Plato. Because indeed, if Plato was alive today, if Plato was a person speaking today, writing today, and if the Republic had come out in the last century, we would consider him to be a proponent of totalitarian thought. And unless we wish for the horrors of the 20th century to repeat themselves, we would treat him as such. We can trace the lineage, the intellectual lineage of Plato and indeed Socrates, because when we talk of Plato, we're talking of Socrates. We can trace their lineage as following on from Pythagoras through to Parmenides, and then we get to Socrates, then we get to Plato, who was a disciple of Socrates, and then we arrive at Aristotle, who was a disciple of Plato. We can see Parmenides in Platonic and Socratic thought because Parmenides believed in the illusory nature of the world and the deceptive nature of our senses. So we're talking about the pre-Socratics here, and unlike Heraclitus, who believed that everything was in flux and everything was constantly changing, Parmenides believed that nothing changed. The senses, according to Parmenides, are illusory, they are illusions, and Parmenides bought into this idea of the one, the infinite. Now, an interesting thing that I find with Parmenides, and this is something that we'll explore more of when we talk about postmodern writers like Cormac McCarthy and indeed great 19th century writers like Herman Melville, is that Parmenides believed that language and thought presupposed existence. The very fact that we talk of something or think of something presupposes and therefore lends credence to the idea that the thing itself actually existed. Now, we can pick this apart and we can refute it, but to me, this sounds rather Jungian. Carl Jung believed that we have the concept of rebirth, for example, reincarnation, the immortality of souls, because somewhere along the line, somewhere in our DNA, in our ancestors, we actually had the concept and we had a fuller understanding of what the words we use frivolously today used to mean, used to signify. So Parmenides believed that words had constant meaning and we end up straying away from their full meaning. Now, Pythagoras, how was Pythagoras influential when it came to Socrates? We could say that mathematics and schools of deductive reasoning begin with Pythagoras. Pythagorean thought is something of an offshoot of Orphism, or the worship of Dionysus, and whilst Pythagoras was essentially the father of deductive reasoning and mathematics and mathematical logical thought, there was also an aspect of the more esoteric, the more spiritual, the more religious strains of thought. We can trace some of the wonderful analogies that we see in the Republic back to Pythagoras. We can see this idea of philosopher kings going back to Pythagoras. We can see the three different kinds of citizen, brass, silver, and gold, also stemming from this pre-Socratic ancestor. Pythagoras also essentially saw us as being channels for heavenly powers or the divine or something otherworldly that works through us. And the way for us to release ourselves from the wheel of birth was by embracing the contemplative life and becoming philosophers. The interesting thing about the Plato-Socrates connection is that if it were not for writers like Plato and Xenophon and Aristophanes, then we wouldn't really know anything about Socrates the Athenian, Socrates the man. What we know of Socrates in large part comes to us from Plato, but what do we know about Plato? We don't know too much about Plato because he's rather invisible in his written work. He's very much a channel for his teacher's thought, Socrates, though contemporary critics would argue that he has silenced some of the more humane lines of thought that his teacher would have gone down and embraced lines of thought that to us today look rather like eugenics and other potentially abhorrent lines of reasoning. Plato did an extraordinary thing with his writing, something that many writers have not been able to do, and he has obscured himself. He is invisible in his work, we don't really hear him, and simultaneously, whilst obscuring himself, he has elevated a really vivid and robust character, the historical figure of his teacher Socrates. Socrates, who we could say is as influential as Jesus Christ, is incredibly hard to pin down for historians. Thank goodness we have the likes of Plato. And indeed, if we didn't have Plato's writings on Socrates, then the writings we would have about this really influential figure would simply be, for the most part, mockeries of him and parodies of his school of thought. We can look to Aristophanes' The Clouds, in which a figure known as Socrates is quite viciously and openly mocked. What do we know about Socrates? Well, we know that he was put to death for supposedly corrupting the youth of Athens. We can see Plato gives us his speech in his Apology. Socrates was prosecuted as an evildoer and for searching into things under earth and above heaven. He was also prosecuted for making the worse appear the better and then teaching his wicked, manipulative ways to others. Now, when he was prosecuted, he was charged with offering his own potential penalty. So the defense would offer a penalty and the prosecution would also offer a penalty, and they would choose between the two offerings. Now, Socrates took the mick a little bit and offered a very, very low financial amount for his proposed penalty, and therefore drew the furore of the council, and they sentenced him to death. Death at the age of 70, which Socrates didn't seem to fight very much. Sentenced to death and sentenced as guilty for not worshipping the gods of the state and for proposing other divinities. Thanks to Plato, we know quite a lot about the man Socrates, but Plato wasn't really a historian, though I for one think that his depictions and descriptions are rather accurate. In Plato's 35 dialogues, we see Plato himself only appear once, really. We'll go into Socrates' trial at another time, but it seems rather alarming that one could be penalised the way Socrates was penalised, but it's worth keeping in mind that even the pre-Socratics, those more primitive ancient philosophers who were probing into cosmology and astronomy and compiling catalogues of the gods, even the pre-Socratics were given quite serious warnings. We might think it rather silly today that one can't just ask some innocent questions, but actually I think it's pretty easy to pull this into focus. Even today, we must exercise caution in what we disseminate, what we spread, and what we express. We must be careful of our thoughts, and we must either censor ourselves on some topics or feel the wrath of censorship from state authorities. Thank goodness Socrates did go around Athens causing a little bit of a nuisance because, as Cicero says, Socrates was the first man to call philosophy down from the heavens and put it into households. Socrates was the first significant philosopher to compel us to bring lines of inquiry into our day-to-day lives and to introspect and reflect and question on how best to live. Now, it's important to have a little bit of historical grounding because with the Republic we have another case of art imitating life. Many will read the Republic as a hypothetical, as a piece of speculative, imaginative literature where these men construct this ideal society, this utopia, so to speak, from the ground up, but they didn't really create it themselves. The template for a society that looks rather similar in places to Plato's Republic is right there in Sparta. And as is usually the case with this sort of thing, there is a wide disparity between romance and reality, myth and reality. The myth of Sparta has endured, but life in Sparta wouldn't have been so great. We can see the myth of Sparta has endured, and we can chart. The infection of the idea from Plutarch down to Mussolini and Hitler's Germany. Of course, Mussolini, his favourite book was Plato's Republic. The history, in a nutshell, goes like this. The Spartans conquered a territory known as Laconia, and they reduced the citizens, the population, to serfs. The Spartans exerted control over the land, but to cultivate it themselves would have been degrading, and it would have taken away from their overarching, primary, and one could even say sole duty, which was warfare. The Spartans were a warrior race, and everything was subservient to warfare. They would be too busy training up as warriors and engaging in battle to actually cultivate the land, so the helots, the serfs, would cultivate it for them, so that they could be free for their military enterprises. Now, of course, the helots, the original population of Laconia, wasn't too happy about this, so Sparta developed a secret police, and they would regularly, on an annual basis in fact, wage war on the serfs and kill whole hordes of them so as to quell rebellions. Spartan existence was all set up for warfare. A Spartan child, from the moment they were born, was raised to engage in warfare, to be a brutal warrior citizen. And we can definitely see a school of eugenic thought in their child rearing, because sickly children were dispensed with. They were thrown away. Only the healthy would be kept alive. And if you've read a little bit of Plato's Republic, the following is going to sound quite familiar to you. The children were all raised together in one big school, and there was no science, there was no studies into the natural world. It was all gymnastics, and it was all military preparation. And they would all mess in together, the boys and the girls, butt naked, and train for warfare. Indeed, the rationale for training the girls in this way was because they believed that warrior women would have better childbearing capabilities. And as a Spartan woman, you'd better hope that you could bear a child, because if you could not, the state would mandate that your husband get his childbearing from another woman. Military service began at the age of 20 after the children's education, and men were considered a fully fledged citizen at the age of 30 and would go to live in a male-only house. The Spartan citizens weren't poor, but they most certainly weren't rich either. And there was a ban on showing emotion. Again, some of this is going to sound familiar for those of you who've read a little bit of Plato's Republic. A woman was not allowed to show sorrow at news of her son being killed in action. The only emotion that one could display was contempt for a coward. As I said, the state could legislate what women a man slept with, and it was in a man's best interest to have as many children as possible, because a father would be exempt from military service when he had 3 children. The constitution of Sparta is incredibly curious to contemplate, and it was multi-tiered, with blends of democracy and aristocracy and tyranny. Sparta was ruled by 2 hereditary kings. One king was the king of war, and the other king was the king of peacetime. The next level of the constitution of Sparta was the Council of Elders. That included 30 men, all above the age of 60, and including the 2 kings, chosen by the citizens. These men needed to be of aristocratic birth. This council would be responsible for trying criminal cases, the criminal cases brought before them by the assembly, which was comprised of the citizens. Now, the assembly or the citizens couldn't initiate or propose any new legislature, but they could vote. They could vote yes or no to propositions brought before them, but they could also be overruled. They could be overruled by the elders, but if in fact they were not overruled, then no law could be enacted without their consent. Another level of the constitution comprised the 5 ephors, who were chosen by the citizens essentially by a lot. And this is where we get the democratic element in the constitution of Sparta. Every month, the 2 kings, the king of war and the king of peace, swore to uphold the constitution, and every month the 5 ephors swore to uphold the kings and make sure they weren't doing anything dodgy. The kings would be followed around by these ephors, who were essentially the watchers. At one point in their history, Sparta did have poets and writers, but they dispensed with them. They kicked them out of the community and embraced war. The reality of Sparta was that the ephors were incredibly easy to bribe, And though the women were said to be chaste, there was actually huge amounts of sexual licentiousness on both parts, men and women. And there was great amounts of greed. Yes, they were supposedly equal. No one was rich, no one was poor. But in much the same way that we can look to many communist states, we can see that there actually was a wide disparity in wealth. And of course, all the while, they were acting as tyrants over the helots. Now that's just a little bit of historical background that I think is important for you to know as you breach the Republic, and as you go through it you'll see why that's so important to have a little bit of knowledge of that. Let's talk about how to read the Republic. Let's talk about mindsets. The first really important thing that I would like to impress upon you when it comes to reading the Republic deeply is to try valiantly to bring the discussions, bring the dialogues into the real world, into your day-to-day. That means write in the margins, keep a journal, pause and think about what's up for discussion, and of course talk about it with other people. Now some people will think they have to come to the same conclusion as Socrates, but as you read through the Republic you'll see that Socrates begins with some really erroneous and faulty underlying assumptions. He says, "Can we all agree?" And then he will say something that makes you think, "No, I don't agree with that, Socrates." Well, if you disagree at any point, be assured and be confident that you are not doing it wrong. You're not reading the Republic wrong. Feel free to disagree. In fact, I believe if you're not disagreeing liberally at different points in the Republic, then that means you're reading it wrong. Disagree freely. You're meant to be bringing this dialogue into real life, and that means you are part of the discussion too. So make sure you're thinking through all of these issues yourself all the way through and thoroughly. That's why I encourage you to take your reading very slow, because you can bring many sleep cycles. When we have a really big decision facing us, we always say, "I'm going to sleep on it," or "You should sleep on it." Well, that's true with the great books too. So sleep on it, bring it into your lived experience, think about it every day over the long term, and feel free to disagree. The next thing I would like to encourage you to do with the Republic is to read it as a philosopher. Of course, it sounds rather obvious, it's a work of philosophy, but do read it as a philosopher, and keep in mind that we are all philosophers. We're all born philosophers. Get in touch with your childlike curiosity. Connect with your inner infant inquisitiveness. When we are children, we are fascinated with the world around us, why certain things are the way they are, why they're not a different way, and we inundate our parents and everybody around us with questions, and we are told at a very early age to be quiet and not ask so many questions. And so our childlike curiosity is quelled, it's pushed down, but it doesn't disappear. And when we read the great books, when we read imaginative literature, and when we read philosophy from the likes of Plato and Aristotle, it is so key to reconnect with that inner child that is still alive and kicking inside us, and ask questions. Enjoy asking questions. Be ye as little children, and ask yourself on a day-to-day basis, what is good? What is evil? What are we? Now, Mortimer Adler, in his terrific How to Read a Book, which I highly recommend you pick up if you haven't already, he reminds us that there are essentially two branches of philosophy. We have that branch of philosophy that deals with being, the nature of being, what is, and we call that speculative philosophy or theoretical philosophy. And then we have the branch of philosophy that deals with not what is but what ought to be, and we call that practical or normative philosophy. You must learn to embrace both branches, embrace your inner child and your inner philosopher, and keep in mind that the meaning of philosopher is to love wisdom. So how do you become a philosopher? Love wisdom. And remember that love is a doing word. It is an action, and it's a decision we make in the present moment over and over again. It's not a feeling. It's a choice, and we make that choice every day of our lives. Today we get up and we say, today I'm going to love wisdom, and that means you're going to act lovingly. And how does one act lovingly when it comes to wisdom? You passionately, slowly, with great curiosity and great gusto and vitality, go through your books each and every day and enjoy the experience. Mortimer Adler also reminds us that whilst there is only one philosophical method, there are currently 5 different styles of philosophical exposition. Let's run through them very briefly and signpost some of the poster boys. So the first type of philosophical exposition is the philosophical dialogue. This kind of philosophy is heuristic, and it leads the reader through the propositions. It leads us through so that we can discover or come to our own conclusions by ourselves through conversation. Throw a little bit of drama and poetry, a little bit of narrative and compelling characters on top, and this kind of philosophy becomes really powerful, really resonant stuff. Cicero and Berkeley are two philosophers that write in the shadow of Plato, but we could argue that no philosopher has done the philosophical dialogue as grandly as Plato and indeed Socrates in works like the Republic. Adler reminds us of a brilliant quote from Whitehead, who says that all Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato. I love that. After the philosophical dialogue, we have the philosophical treatise, of which Aristotle, one of my personal favourite philosophers, Aristotle is the poster boy for the treatise. We can see this kind of philosophy in Aristotle's physics, his metaphysics, ethics, and poetics. We can also see this kind of exposition in Immanuel Kant, who brings order and clarity to the questions. In that way, it's rather similar to the philosophical dialogue, but without the drama. With the philosophical treatise, essentially, we just have the exposition and the questions. The next kind of philosophical exposition is known as meeting objections, and Thomas Aquinas is a good poster boy for this with his Summa Theologica. You're most likely to see this in medieval schools of thought. This style of philosophy is all about raising questions and meeting objections. And this is very much a medieval view because this is conflict, or sees conflict as the pathway to discovery. And this style is essentially a great debate in the oral tradition. Now, the next philosophical exposition is the systematization of philosophy. The poster pin-ups for this style of exposition are Descartes and Spinoza. And this is essentially all about clothing philosophy in mathematical dress, dressing up one's philosophy in formality, certainty, formulations, propositions and proofs. And we have another style of philosophical exposition in the form of the aphoristic style. Now, I'm a huge fan of the aphoristic style, and the poster pin-up, we might say, is Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. Pascal, with works like his Pensées, is also a good representation of what the aphoristic style of philosophy can do. Philosophical aphorisms are designed to be digestible, but they're also designed to have a lot that's unsaid. This is essentially the art of ellipsis. So essentially, the philosopher has done the thinking for us, but doesn't always show their working out. So there's a good and a bad when it comes to that style of philosophy. Again, riffing off of Adler here, and to re-emphasize, I do thoroughly recommend How to Read a Book, and I also recommend Bertrand Russell's History of Philosophy. It's a really great work. Adler breaks down approaching philosophy into two main parts. In part one, you must attempt to discover what is known as the ruling principle of the philosopher, and you do this through years and years of reading and rereading and attentive, deep rereading, speaking, writing. Plato's ruling principle is about the importance of conversation to discover truth, the truth of how best to live, whereas a philosopher such as Kant, his ruling principle is all about the limitations of the mind. But this is something that you must discover for yourself. Yes, we can use aided discovery, but this is most certainly a journey that you are embarking upon when you meet a new philosopher. And then part two of reading philosophy is all about seeing if the philosopher is consistent with their own ruling principles. And then you need to make a decision as to whether you agree with the ruling principle or you agree with the conclusion, or of course neither. And as we become philosophers, we must keep in mind that with a lot of philosophy, the terminology that is deployed is accessible by the layperson. That means the specialist terminology is actually embedded in abstract words that we use every day. So there's an incredible amount of importance when it comes to defining our terms. So often we are talking about essentially two wildly different things, but using the same words. We must always begin by defining our terms, and Socrates teaches us that. Now, the third mindset that I would like to give you is to re-emphasize that you should be reading the Republic as though it were a piece of imaginative literature. That means use your theatre of the mind and stage it, or think about how you might stage it. Read it as though it is a gripping, compelling novel and you want to see what happens next. Learn about what it was like to be an Athenian citizen at the time and participate in the discussion as though you yourself were that Athenian citizen. Read the works of Plato as a grand, overarching drama. The really incredible thing about the Republic is we are treated not only to the dialogues and not only to stage-worthy drama, but we're also treated to Socrates' interiority. We get to learn about his inner motivation, what he chooses to say and what he chooses not to say, which means that we get the best of both worlds. We get to have a Socratic conversation, we get to see a play, but we also get to garner a more intimate knowledge of Socrates than those who were present. My next tip to you is an offshoot of reading the Republic as imaginative literature. Read the characters that you are introduced to as allegory. Read the work as visionary narrative. Read symbol and allusion. Read metaphor. And of course, read the work as a series of grand essays, held together by a narrative. Because by the time you reach the end of the Republic, you have learnt to appreciate metaphor and to think in metaphor. And indeed, Aristotle teaches us that metaphor, or thinking in metaphor, is the highest level of thought. You have learnt to read parable. You have learnt to read microcosm. You've learnt to read allegory. And you can take what you've learnt from the Republic into all of the great books that are lining your shelves, waiting to be read next. And if you ever find yourself taking an interest in utopic fiction or the fiction of utopia and indeed dystopia, like I did in my first year of university, then you must begin with Plato's Republic, because you have an exciting world of speculative fiction ahead of you if you're interested in the creation of different worlds. There's a lot of great world building going on in Plato, but of course his world building is a grand political act, and we could say in the greatest pieces of imaginative literature that fall under the categorization of speculative fiction, that's science fiction and fantasy, we could say that ultimately these works are political acts too. When we read utopia fiction, we are always trying to see justice and morality in the individual, but on a macro level, on the level of the city. And so the really exciting thing with Plato is we become founders of a new city and we get to create it in speech, in real time, and see if it succeeds or fails. We get to see the potential genesis of justice and if indeed justice does emerge. If you really enjoy Plato's Utopia, then I would implore you to pick up Thomas More's Utopia next. You could also read Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, and of course you would have Jonathan Swift's marvellous, charming Gulliver's Travels waiting for you too. Now, of course, whether Plato's Republic is a utopia or dystopia is certainly a rich conversation. Karl Popper most certainly believed that Plato's Republic was a totalitarian regime, and Leo Strauss and Alan Bloom both impress upon us the fact that what we have isn't really a blueprint for a real city, but rather a learning exercise in philosophical dialogue, and I would agree. The reason we read utopia fiction is because we have a lot to learn from imaginary worlds. I quote Oscar Wilde, who said, "A map of the world that does not include utopia is not even worth glancing at, for it leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing. And when humanity lands there, it looks out and, seeing a better country, sets sail. Progress is the realization of utopias." Another great way to read the dialogues of Socrates is to see Socrates as a master of persuasion and indeed a master of trolling too. Examine and take notes about how he paces and leads, how he asks questions, what questions he asks, how he picks apart underlying assumptions, how he uses questions as putting matters of extreme importance into a vice, and of course how he is rigorous in defining his terms. If you're interested in learning how to be more persuasive, you may find it useful and entertaining to read The Republic up against a work such as Arthur Conan Doyle's The Sign of the Four. Read Socrates and Sherlock Holmes back to back and take notes, and you'll learn a lot about deductive reasoning. But of course, something to keep in mind is that there are a lot of logical fallacies on the part of Socrates. Sometimes his assumptions to us are just plain wrong, and we disagree from the get-go. We wouldn't have the Republic at all if it were not for the grand assumption, the underlying assumption that justice is a part of the best city. We have another underlying assumptions in the fact that Socrates assumes that a city is analogous to an individual's soul. I personally find it useful to read the Republic in a manner that it most likely wasn't written in, and that is to see such things as the idea of the noble lie as a way of orienting ourselves and trying to discern what the various, because there most certainly is more than one, the various noble lies in our day-to-day existence are. Now, of course, that wasn't the aim of Plato, that wasn't the aim of Socrates, but for those of us who like to think rather meta, those of us who have seer-like abilities and would like to exercise our visionary prowess, you may wish to see this as your training ground to discern how you are being governed. What are the unsaid implicit assumptions that may be wrong, that you take for granted in your day-to-day life? Now, it's very easy to ask that question, not so easy to answer it. And of course, this is a charge that was levelled at Socrates many times. The noble lie in the Republic is a lie that is told to the citizens so as to essentially condition them for war. One of the main problems we come up against in designing a great city, and a city that is anything more than a city for sows or pigs, to paraphrase Glaucon, the main problem is education. We can take care of shelter and food and our basic needs, but ultimately it's education. And education is responsible for getting the citizens living harmoniously, conditioning them to be friendly to one another and hostile to the enemies. We're told in the Republic that it's appropriate for the rulers, if for anyone at all, to lie for the benefit of the city in cases involving enemies or citizens, while all the rest must not put their hands to anything of the sort. And so he culls Homer. He gets rid of the Iliad and the Odyssey and other works of the great classic Greek texts. And that's because these texts show protagonists as, in places having the vice of cowardice, for example. What we get in the Republic is a justification for censorship, state censorship, banning of art, and a complete conditioning, a brainwashing of the citizens so as they do not become cowards and so that they die faithfully for their country without question. Plato's argument, essentially, is that the imitative arts are rather dangerous because if they show morally abhorrent behaviours, the citizens will copy them. Now, we might be on the fence with this because we might think, on the one hand, well, censorship is wrong, but he's kind of also onto something there too. And ultimately, we might need to think through for ourselves where we land on that issue. And as I said, it's important to feel emboldened enough to disagree with what you read in the Republic, if indeed you do disagree. Over the course of your reading of the Republic, continue to bring the conversation into your real life. And I highly recommend that you read this great work with a group. The Hardcore Literature Book Club is an incredible community with the most friendly, empathetic, and passionate lovers of literature, lovers of philosophy, lovers of the great books that you can find anywhere in the world. We come from all over the world and we are united by our common love for literature and humanity. And so the discussion in the Hardcore Literature Book Club around the Republic is going to be incredible. Remember that what we are reading in the Republic is a dialogue. And if it is a dialogue, we should bring it into the real world and we should treat it as such and we should talk about it with each other endlessly. And most importantly of all, I would really like to embolden you to make up your own mind. Think everything through for yourself. Be rigorous, be careful, be passionate, and own whatever conclusion you come to off the back of that passion and rigour. Ultimately, I would like to leave it there for today. I think that's a nice little initial conversation just to get us prepped, just to get us thinking, just to get us ready for breaching the Republic boldly. We have a great series of book club lectures that will be guiding you through a deep and careful reading of Plato's Republic. Our first deep dive will ask you to read the first 2 books of the Republic ahead of time and then come to the lecture prepared to comb through your underlinings, your notes, and participate in the conversation. That deep dive is all about convention under attack and the challenge to Socrates. The reading assignment for the lecture after that is for books 3 to 5. How to build utopia, and we will be talking about the noble lie. the three metals and the guardians of the city. We'll be breaking down the analogues between soul and city, and we'll talk about the three waves and the proposal for state intervention, legislature and control when it comes to sexual intercourse. The lecture after that is called Educating Philosopher Kings, and will require you to read books 5 to 7. We'll be talking about the call for philosopher kings, the doctrine of ideas, and the metaphor of the cave. And then we have a lecture on the myth of which will require you to read books 8 to 10. We'll talk about unjust constitutions, democracies, oligarchies, democracies, and tyrannies. We'll talk about what an aristocracy ruled by philosopher kings looks like. We'll talk about the rejection of imitative art, the reincarnation of souls, and the banishment of poets. So it's going to be good fun, it's going to be really thought-provoking and illuminating, and I wish you all the very best of luck in breaching Plato's Republic. And for now, let us know your experience with Plato. If this is your first time coming to Plato in a significant way, then let us know what your expectations are. What challenges do you think you have up ahead? What are you expecting to gain from the experience? What would you like to gain from the experience? And of course, if this is a deep reread, then let us know what parts of the Republic you, dare I say, agreed with, and which parts you disagreed with, and what some of the most thought-provoking parts of the Republic were for you. Thank you very much for watching today. I hope you have a lovely day, and happy reading, everybody. Bye-bye for now.